This video provides an overview of the paper Safeguarding Women at Work, Lessons from Aotearoa New Zealand on Effectively Implementing Domestic Violence Policies, published in a special issue of the Journal of Industrial Relations on Workplace Gender Equality. Where are we and where to next? In this video, we hear from Drs. Ruth Wetherill and Mihaela Gavin, who co-wrote the paper with Dr. Natalie Thorburn. They'll discuss why they wrote the paper and its significance for advancing workplace gender equality.
The main aim for our paper was to tell the story of how domestic violence became positioned as a gendered industrial issue, and from that basis, develop a theoretical framework and research and practice agenda to advance work on that issue. Understanding domestic violence as an industrial issue is quite new, both in industrial relations scholarship broadly and in practice with workplaces. So there's a lot of work to be done in thinking about how we can develop practices and frameworks and policies for supporting victims of violence at work, and then how we can actually go ahead and implement those policies effectively. So our inspiration for this paper came from my involvement and our other co-author, Dr. Natalie Thorburn's involvement in the development of the Domestic Violence Victims Protection Act, which was passed in 2018 in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This piece of legislation was a landmark, not just in New Zealand, but internationally, for codifying the responsibility of workplaces to victims of violence. So in the development of that legislation, we found that there was a tension between the business case for workplaces paying attention to domestic violence, which was very much around that it was a cost-saving measure because if they supported victims of violence, they would reduce absenteeism or turnover. And the social case for domestic violence, which is about us supporting victims of violence impacted by a devastating social issue and finding pathways to safety and to make sure that they can reintegrate after that violence back into the community and into work. So alongside those tensions, there were a huge range of actors involved in the development and passing of this legislation, including MPs, NGOs, trade unions, and business networks, who all had different angles on approaching this issue, but who were all really invested in making sure that there were solid frameworks for safeguarding victims of violence. So alongside the passing of the legislation, Dr. Natalie Thorburn and I were doing some other research around stories of victims of violence who had been subjected to stalking and harassment, and the workplace kept coming up as a really important element of their stories and of their experiences. And while some victims of violence had a really positive experience with their employer, there were still a lot of issues that we were seeing of workplaces sort of not understanding domestic violence as a social issue or not knowing how to provide that kind of support. So this sort of involvement in the legislation and our understanding of victims' needs on the front line, we really wanted to write a paper that would advance these discussions and sort of draw together some various areas of theory and practice to create a solid framework for doing so. We've written the paper for a wide variety of people. So we have written it for industrial relations scholars to really cement domestic violence as an industrial issue that we need to pay attention to, particularly in relation to gender equality in the workplace. The paper is also for interdisciplinary scholars who also have an interest in domestic violence, so in social work or law, and who want to understand the role of workplaces within that broader framework. And finally, we believe that the theoretical framework that we've developed will be really useful for trade unions, NGOs, public bodies, and of course workplaces and employers to give them a way of understanding their role and what we can do to best support victims of violence at work.
The core ideas of the paper are grounded in feminist scholarship related to the conceptualization of the public and the private. In this paper, we take Mary Wollstonecraft's seminal text, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, originally published in the 18th century as inspiration to understand and reconcile what we see as private issues and public issues. Essentially, the private and the public are not static concepts or domains. Indeed, more recently, feminist industrial relations scholars and writers and activists in the area of domestic violence have also challenged our traditional concepts of the public and the private. Our paper takes readers through several vignettes or short stories highlighting how domestic violence is not only a gendered issue, but an issue that collapses these domains. In one particular story we read in the paper, Claire discusses how her abuser left a note in a public car park where she normally catches the train to work, and describes the limited support she received from her manager, who didn't see this as an issue relevant to work. This paper is really a conversation starter for the work that still remains around domestic violence and industrial relations, both theoretically and practically. Domestic violence isn't a private issue, but a public issue embedded in broader patterns of gender inequality, as well as an industrial and workplace issue. We recognise that much more work needs to be done in understanding the blurred lines between work and home and ideas of risk and safety, and also addressing the needs of women who have been acutely affected in this experience, like those in casual, seasonal, or precarious employment. Our paper really gives a framework for understanding domestic violence as a social issue and also apply this knowledge in a workplace setting. There is significant opportunity for workplaces to have a positive impact on the lives of victims of violence, but only if we effectively recognise this as a socio-political, gendered issue.